It's the evening of August 8th, 1974. The curtains in the Oval Office are partially closed. The golden light from the lamps barely illuminates the tense face of a 61-year-old man who is about to make history in the most humiliating way possible. Richard Milhouse Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, adjusts his tie in front of the television cameras. His hands tremble slightly. In less than 10 minutes, he will utter the words no American president has ever said: "I resign." Outside, on the White House lawns, hundreds of journalists wait. The Washington air is thick with tension and summer humidity. Inside the most powerful building in the world, the silence is sepulchral. Those in attendance avoid looking at each other. Everyone knows they are witnessing the end of an era, the collapse of a political empire built over decades of ambition, cunning, and, ultimately, betrayal. Nixon looks directly into the camera. His face, marked by dark circles and exhaustion, shows a mixture of defiance and defeat. He begins to speak in a controlled, almost cold voice. He doesn't admit guilt. He doesn't apologize. He simply explains that, without the necessary political support in Congress, he must leave office in the interest of America. It's a speech calculated, even in its apparent humility. 70 million Americans are watching their black and white televisions. Many feel anger. Others, a strange compassion for this man who, just 2 years earlier, had won re-election with one of the most overwhelming victories in the country's electoral history. How did he get here? How did such a brilliant, meticulously strategic politician end up being the only president forced to resign to avoid impeachment? The answer has a name that will resonate for generations: Watergate. A scandal that began as a clumsy burglary in an office building and morphed into a web of lies, cover-ups, and abuse of power that shook the foundations of American democracy. But Watergate wasn't the beginning. It was a final symptom of something deeper: the growing paranoia of a man who never felt fully accepted by the ruling elite. Nixon wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't a bloodthirsty dictator. He was something far more complex, and for that very reason, more fascinating. A political genius consumed by his own inner demons, a brilliant strategist incapable of trusting anyone, a visionary leader who destroyed his own legacy because he couldn't control his obsession with enemies, real and imagined. But before the scandal, before the resignation, before the national shame, there was a boy, a poor boy in a forgotten California town, a brilliant student rejected by elite universities, a young lawyer with boundless ambitions and an insecurity that would never leave him. To understand how Richard Nixon fell, we must first understand how he rose. And that story begins 40 years earlier, in a place where no one would expect a president to be born. January 9th, 1913. Richard Milhouse Nixon is born in a small wooden house in Yorba Linda, California. He is the second of 5 children in a working-class Quaker family. His father, Frank Nixon, is a man of explosive temper who fails in every business he undertakes. His mother, Hannah, is the exact opposite: serene, deeply religious, emotionally distant. Nixon's childhood is marked by poverty and tragedy. 2 of his brothers will die of tuberculosis before he reaches adulthood. The family lives on the brink of constant financial ruin. There are no luxuries, no vacations, no room for error. From a very early age, Richard learns that the world is a harsh place where only the strongest survive. And he learns something else: that he must be perfect to be loved. In high school, Nixon is an extraordinary but socially awkward student. He studies obsessively, debates ferociously, and wins every academic competition possible. But his classmates find him odd, too intense, unable to relax. He doesn't fit in. He'll never truly fit in. He applies to Harvard University and Yale. Both reject him. He ends up attending Whittier College, a small local Quaker institution. It's a wound that will never fully heal. During his college years, Nixon developed the skills that would define his career: relentless debate, a photographic memory for detail, and an ability to work harder than any competitor. But he also developed something darker: a sense that the Eastern elites, the Harvard and Yale graduates, the wealthy with prestigious surnames, would always view him as an outsider. This perception of exclusion would fuel his resentment for decades. After college, Nixon attends Duke Law School, where he is again the hardest working, if not the brightest, student. He graduates and returns to California to practice law in Whittier. These are monotonous years. Contracts, wills, petty business disputes. Nothing to satisfy his burning ambition. He marries Thelma Catherine Ryan in 1940, a reserved schoolteacher who will become his silent companion for 5 decades. Then World War II arrives. Nixon enlists in the Navy and serves in the South Pacific, not in direct combat, but as a logistics officer. He learns to play poker, wins thousands of dollars gambling, and proves to be an excellent organizer. The war gives him something he never had: patriotic service credentials and a network of political contacts. When he returns to California in 1946, he no longer wants to be a small-town lawyer. He wants power. The local Republican Party is looking for a young candidate to challenge Democratic Congressman Jerry Voorhis. Nixon runs an aggressive campaign, insinuating without evidence that Voorhis has communist sympathies. We are at the dawn of the Cold War. Fear of communism is beginning to take hold in the United States. Nixon instinctively understands that anti-communism is the quickest path to power. He wins the election. At 33, Richard Nixon is a congressman. In Washington, he joined the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was here that he built his national reputation with the Alger Hiss case, a State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy. Nixon pursued Hiss with obsessive determination, eventually obtaining a conviction for perjury. The national media began to pay attention to this young California congressman who was unafraid to stand up to liberal elites. In 1950, just 4 years after entering Congress, Nixon ran for the Senate. His opponent was Helen Gahagan Douglas, whom Nixon nicknamed the Pink Lady for her supposed leftist sympathies. The campaign was brutal, filled with innuendo and half-truths. Nixon won handily. 2 years later, in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower selected him as his vice presidential candidate. Nixon was barely 39 years old, but almost immediately his career is on the verge of collapse. It is revealed that wealthy businessmen have been funding a secret fund to cover their political expenses. The scandal explodes. Eisenhower considers replacing him on the running. Nixon responds with a masterstroke of political communication. On September 23, 1952, Nixon appeared on national television to defend himself. In what would become known as a Checker speech, Nixon dramatically exposed his family's finances and admitted he'd accepted a gift, a Cocker Spaniel his daughter named Checkers. In a cracking voice, he declared that no matter what anyone said, his family would keep that dog. It was corny, it was manipulative, it was brilliant. 60 million Americans watched. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Eisenhower kept him on the ticket. Nixon has just learned a fundamental lesson. Television can save or destroy a political career. It's a lesson that, 2 decades later, will tragically come back to haunt him. But for now, he has survived. The question is, at what cost? And what would this man, this obsessive survivor, do when he finally achieved absolute power? January 1953. Richard Nixon becomes the second youngest vice president in American history. It should be the pinnacle of his career. But he quickly discovers the bitter truth about the office. The vice president has no real power. Eisenhower, the war general turned president, treats Nixon with polite indifference. He sends him on endless diplomatic trips while important decisions are made without him. Nixon traveled to 56 countries during his vice presidency. He shook hands, attended banquets, and delivered ceremonial speeches. But what he really did during these years was study. He observed how foreign governments worked. He memorized the names of thousands of political leaders. He built a global network of contacts. And, most importantly, he developed a sophisticated understanding of the foreign policy that would eventually define his presidency. May 1958. In Caracas, Venezuela, Nixon's motorcade is attacked by angry anti-American protesters. They smash the car windows with metal pipes. They spit on the vice president. For 12 terrifying minutes, Nixon believes he will be lynched on a South American street. Bodyguards manage to get him out. When he returns to the United States, he is greeted as a hero who risked his life serving his country. The incident in Caracas reveals something crucial about Nixon. Under extreme pressure, he doesn't crumble. He has a coolness, almost a callousness, that allows him to function when others would panic. It's an admirable quality. It's also terrifying because it suggests a man disconnected from normal emotions, capable of doing anything if logic justifies it. July 1959. Nixon visits Moscow to inaugurate an exhibition of American technology. In a replica American kitchen, he comes face to face with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader. What begins as a polite exchange escalates into an impromptu debate on capitalism versus communism, broadcast on television to millions. Nixon is undaunted. He argues with Khrushchev as an equal, defending the American system with confidence and clarity. The kitchen debate turns Nixon into a Cold War hero. Here's an American standing up to the communist leader without flinching. The American press praises him. Popularity polls rise. Nixon begins to look not just like a future presidential candidate, but like the inevitable candidate for 1960. July 1960. The Republican National Convention in Chicago is a pure formality. Nixon wins the presidential nomination on the first ballot. He is 47 years old, has 8 years of experience as vice president, and is widely recognized nationally. His Democratic opponent is John F. Kennedy, a relatively unknown senator from Massachusetts, Catholic, wealthy, charismatic, but considered too young and inexperienced. All the advantages seem to be on Nixon's side. Eisenhower, though lukewarm in his support, is a popular president. The economy is stable. Republicans are confident of victory, as is Nixon. But there is something he didn't calculate, something that will change American politics forever. Television is no longer just a communication tool. It has become the battleground where elections are won and lost. September 26, 1960. 70 million Americans tune in to the first televised presidential debate in history. Nixon arrives ill, having lost weight due to a recent infection. He refuses makeup. He wears a gray suit that blends into the studio background. Under the bright lights, his pale face gleams with sweat. He has the shadow of a stubble by 5 in the afternoon. He looks uncomfortable, sick, evasive. Kennedy, by contrast, arrives tanned, rested, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. He spent the day relaxing on the rooftop of his hotel. He embraces professional makeup. He looks directly into the camera when he speaks, as if conversing with every viewer in his living room. He is young, handsome, and confident. Those listening to the debate on the radio think Nixon won substantially. Those watching on television have no doubt. Kennedy completely dominated. November 8, 1960. The election results are devastatingly close. Kennedy wins by a mere 118,000 votes out of the nearly 69 million popular vote cast. It's a margin of 0.17%. Nixon and his supporters suspect fraud, particularly in Illinois and Texas, where irregularities seem evident. Nixon's advisors pressure him to challenge the results, launch investigations, and fight to the bitter end. Nixon refuses. In a show of uncharacteristic political grace, he concedes defeat without initiating a constitutional crisis. Publicly, he acts like the magnanimous statesman. Internally, he is devastated. He has come so close. He has worked his entire life for this moment, and he lost it by a handful of votes, possibly due to fraud that will never be proven. The seed of bitterness is planted deep. Nixon returns to California a defeated man. He is no longer vice president. He no longer holds any office. He is just a 50-year-old lawyer with an uncertain political future. In 1962, he makes what he will later call the biggest mistake of his career. He runs for governor of California against Democrat Pat Brown. He loses again, this time by a considerable margin. The morning after the defeat, Nixon calls a press conference. He is tired, furious, humiliated. He abandons all pretense of dignity and lashes out at the reporters who, he says, have treated him unfairly for years. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, he tells them bitterly. This is my last press conference. The journalists present think they have just witnessed the end of Richard Nixon's political career. They are completely wrong. Nixon moves to New York and joins a prestigious law firm. He earns a lot of money. He buys an elegant apartment. From the outside, it seems he's finally embraced a private life. But those who know him know the truth. Nixon has never stopped planning his comeback. He reads voraciously. He maintains contact with Republican political leaders. He travels constantly, giving speeches, fundraising for local candidates, building a network of favors that he will one day call in. Meanwhile, Kennedy's presidency ends in tragedy in Dallas in November 1963. Lyndon Johnson takes office and wins the 1964 election by a landslide. The Republicans, defeated and demoralized, begin to look toward 1968. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the name that keeps reappearing is Richard Nixon. 1967. Vietnam is shattering Johnson's presidency. American cities are burning with race riots. The youth counterculture is challenging all established norms. The country seems to be disintegrating. Moderate voters, frightened by the chaos, are seeking order and stability. Nixon sees his opportunity. He announces his presidential candidacy with a simple message: law and order. The 1968 campaign is a masterpiece of political reinvention. Nixon has learned from his past mistakes. He carefully controls every public appearance. He uses television intelligently, in controlled formats. He speaks vaguely of a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. He promises to represent the silent majority of Americans who are fed up with the chaos. He is Nixon 2.0, more polished, more careful, more calculated. November 5, 1968. Nixon defeats Vice President Hubert Humphrey in another close election. He wins the Electoral College comfortably, but the popular vote by only half percentage point. After 8 years in political wilderness, after 2 humiliating defeats, Richard Nixon becomes the 37th President of the United States. He is 55 years old. He has achieved his life's goal. But here's the question no one asks in that moment of triumph. What will a man who has spent decades feeling hounded by enemies, who has never forgotten or forgiven a wrong, do when he finally controls the most powerful apparatus of the American government? The answer will begin to reveal itself in ways no one, not even Nixon himself, can fully anticipate. January 20th, 1969. On the steps of the Capitol, his hand on the family Bible, Richard Nixon is sworn in as president. It's a cold day in Washington. The ceremony is formal, traditional. In his inaugural address, Nixon speaks of uniting the divided nation, of lowering the tone in public debate. These are beautiful words. But from day one, the reality inside the White House will be radically different. Nixon immediately established a governing style that reflected his personality: isolated, distrustful, obsessed with control. He worked primarily with 2 aides: H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, a fanatically loyal former advertising executive, and John Ehrlichman, his domestic policy advisor. Both acted as gatekeepers, filtering who could see the president and controlling the flow of information. Nixon preferred to work alone, writing memos rather than meeting with people. Inside the Oval Office, Nixon keeps a list, literally, a written list of his political enemies: journalists who criticize him, actors who ridiculed him, politicians who oppose him. The list grows constantly. Nixon speaks about his enemies with an intensity that worries even his closest allies. He orders tax investigations against journalists. He requests intelligence on political opponents. He considers dissent as personal betrayal. Kissinger, his brilliant but equally paranoid national security advisor, shares this siege mentality. Together, they create a culture of extreme secrecy. Staff members' phone calls are monitored to detect leaks. Communication channels are established that bypass the Secretaries of State and Defense. The government operates through secret maneuvers and institutionalized distrust. But while Nixon nurses his domestic obsessions, he faces a real and deadly problem: Vietnam. More than 500,000 American soldiers are trapped in a war they cannot win. Every week, hundreds return in coffins. Protests at home intensify. Nixon promised peace with honor, but secretly knows the United States must withdraw. The question is how to do it without appearing defeated. Nixon implements Vietnamization, training the South Vietnamese army to fight its own war while U.S. troops gradually withdraw. It's a sensible but slow strategy. Meanwhile, he orders massive, secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos, supposedly neutral countries, attempting to destroy Viet Cong sanctuaries. These bombings are kept hidden from Congress and the American public. It's the first act of a pattern. When faced with a difficult problem, Nixon chooses deception. But Nixon isn't just paranoid and obscure. He's also a brilliant strategist capable of thinking decades ahead. In 1969, he began to contemplate the unthinkable, normalizing relations with communist China. For 2 decades, the United States had treated China as an existential enemy. Nixon himself built his career as a communist hunter, but now he sees an extraordinary geopolitical opportunity. China and the Soviet Union, both communists, have become bitter enemies. Nixon reasons, if the United States gets closer to China, it can use it as a counterweight to the Soviets. This is triangular diplomacy of the highest sophistication. But first, he must convince China that he is sincere and conservative Americans that he is not a traitor. It will be his greatest political achievement and will require years of secret maneuvering. To facilitate these negotiations, Nixon and Kissinger established completely secret channels of communication with Beijing. They use intermediaries in Pakistan and Romania. Not even Secretary of State William Rogers knows what's going on. Vice President Spiro Agnew is completely in the dark. It's government by conspiracy, and Nixon prefers it that way. Every secret makes him feel powerful, in control, smarter than everyone else. This addiction to secrecy has psychological consequences. Nixon becomes increasingly isolated. He spends hours alone in his office, in the executive office building, writing bitter notes about imaginary enemies. He drinks increasingly in the evenings. His outbursts of rage become legendary among the staff. But publicly, he maintains the mask of total control. April 30th, 1970. Nixon publicly announces that he has ordered the invasion of Cambodia to destroy communist sanctuaries. The reaction is explosive. American universities erupt in massive protests. On May 4th, the National Guard fires on unarmed students at Kent State University in Ohio. 4 young people die. The country is horrified. Hundreds of universities close on strike. Nixon seems to be losing control of the country. Nixon's response is revealing. He expresses no remorse. Instead, he blames the protesters. He calls them barbarians. He orders the FBI to intensify surveillance of student groups. He becomes convinced that a coordinated conspiracy, likely financed by foreigners, is behind the protests. He cannot accept that ordinary citizens are simply horrified by the war. It must all be a conspiracy against him personally. But that same night, Nixon does something extraordinary and strange. At 4 a.m., accompanied only by his valet, he leaves the White House and goes to the Lincoln Memorial. There he finds a group of student protesters camping out. He tries to talk to them about football and travel. The students are baffled. They want to talk about the war. Nixon can't connect. After 40 minutes, he leaves. It's one of the most revealing moments of his presidency. A president so disconnected from the nation's youth that, even when he tries to build bridges, he can only make small talk. Nixon will later say it was the most poignant moment of his presidency. Students will remember it as deeply strange. It's the gap between Nixon's self-image and how others see him, condensed into one awkward pre-dawn interaction. June 1971. The New York Times begins publishing the Pentagon Papers, a secret government study of the Vietnam War that reveals decades of official deception. Nixon should be pleased. The study primarily covers the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, not his own. But he isn't. He sees the leak as a personal attack on the principle of government secrecy. Nixon orders the creation of a special unit to stop leaks. The plumbers. Their official job is to cover up leaks of classified information. Their real work quickly becomes something more sinister, conducting covert operations against Nixon's political enemies. They steal psychiatric files from whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg in an attempt to discredit him. It's a crossroads. They're no longer protecting state secrets. They're using government resources to destroy citizens. Nixon becomes increasingly obsessed with the 1972 election. He must win. He cannot bear another defeat. He orders his aides to establish a re-election committee separate from the normal Republican Party structure. The committee to re-elect the president, sarcastically known as CREEP. They give him millions of dollars in cash, with no real oversight and no clear ethical restrictions. The committee employs dirty tricks against Democratic opponents, spreading false rumors, sabotaging campaigns, creating fake advocacy organizations. It's scumbag politics, and Nixon fully approves of it. He's waited too long for this moment. He's been humiliated too many times. He'll do whatever it takes to win. Absolutely whatever it takes. June 17, 1972. At 2:30 a.m., 5 men are arrested breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex in Washington. They are carrying sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. One of them has the White House telephone number in his address book. It is an incompetent and seemingly senseless break-in. Nixon is in Florida when he receives the news. His first reaction is irritation, not panic. It's just a third-rate robbery. He can't imagine that this minor incident, this clumsy mistake made by low-level operatives, will be the thread that, when pulled, will unravel his entire presidency. But it will be, because Nixon is about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He's going to cover up the crime. And that cover-up will destroy him. February 1972, for months before the Watergate break-in, Air Force One lands in Beijing. Richard Nixon becomes the first U.S. president to visit communist China. It's a historic moment of epic proportions. America's most famous communist hunter shakes hands with Mao Zedong, the leader of the world's greatest communist revolution. Cameras capture every moment. The world watches in awe. Nixon walks on the Great Wall of China, sharing elaborate banquets with Premier Zhou Enlai, discussing philosophy and geopolitics for hours. No formal treaties are signed, no concrete commitments yet. But the door is open. 2 decades of hostility are beginning to thaw. It is diplomacy of the highest order, and Nixon is in his element. Strategic, patient, thinking about the global chessboard while others barely see the individual pieces. Nixon returns to the United States as a conquering hero. Even the liberal newspapers that despise him must acknowledge the brilliance of the move. It has fundamentally reshaped global politics. China is no longer just the monolithic enemy. The Soviets, terrified of being isolated, are suddenly eager to improve their own relations with Washington. Nixon has created exactly the strategic triangle he envisioned. For the first time in his life, the intellectual elites of the East treat him with genuine respect. Harvard and Yale professors who once despised him now call him a visionary. It's the validation Nixon has sought for decades. It should be enough. He should be able to enjoy this moment. But he can't. Paranoia never rests. Even at the height of diplomatic triumph, he still sees enemies around every corner. May 1972. Nixon travels to Moscow for the first summit with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. They signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT-I. It is the first significant agreement to limit the nuclear weapons of the 2 superpowers. Nixon sits with Brezhnev at his dacha, drinking vodka, negotiating technical details about missiles and nuclear warheads. It is tough, complex, crucial diplomacy. In just 4 months, Nixon has visited both Beijing and Moscow, something unthinkable a year earlier. He has transformed U.S. international relations more profoundly than any president since Truman. And politically, he has secured his re-election. What Democrat can compete with these achievements? None. Nixon knows it. And yet his campaign continues with dirty dealings, tricks, and operational paranoia. Why? Because Nixon can never believe he's won enough. June 1972. The Watergate break-in barely makes headlines. The Washington Post devotes a story to it on the inside page. Most media outlets ignore it. It's a minor incident in an election year. But inside the White House, there's panic. The arrested men have connections to Nixon's re-election committee. One of them, E. Howard Hunt, worked for the plumbers. The threads lead dangerously close to the president. Nixon gathers his top aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Dean, the White House counsel. They discuss options. They could tell the truth, that some subordinate operatives acted without authorization. It's embarrassing, but manageable. Or they could cover up, pay hush money to those arrested, use the CIA to block the FBI investigation. Nixon chooses a cover-up. It's his nature. He's always solved problems through secrecy and manipulation. Why change now? November 7, 1972. Nixon crushes Democratic candidate George McGovern in one of the largest electoral victories in American history. He wins 49 of 50 states. He captures more than 60% of the popular vote. It is the total triumph he has dreamed of his entire life. On election night, he should be the happiest man in the country, but his celebration is strangely subdued, almost melancholic. Nixon has reached the absolute pinnacle of American political power. He has achieved historic diplomatic successes. He has been overwhelmingly validated by the electorate, and yet he feels no joy, only emptiness, because his entire life has been defined by struggle, by the pursuit of goals. Now that he has reached the pinnacle, what remains? And beneath the surface of this triumph, the Watergate scandal continues to grow silently, like the cancer that will eventually kill him. January 1973. After years of brutal negotiations, Henry Kissinger signs the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam. American troops will begin to withdraw. Prisoners of war will return. Nixon declares he has achieved peace with honor, but everyone involved knows the truth. It is a disguised withdrawal. South Vietnam will collapse in a matter of years. The 58,000 Americans who died for nothing. Nixon sells the agreement as a victory through sheer rhetorical willpower. And functionally, for the United States, the war is over. The soldiers are coming home. But the legacy is bitter. The United States has lost its first war. Trust in government has been shattered by years of deception about the war's progress. And Nixon, who promised to end the war quickly, prolonged it for 4 more years, costing another 20,000 American lives. It's a poisoned achievement. March 1973. James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, sends a letter to Judge John Sirica. In it, he claims that there was perjury during the trial, that there was political pressure to keep the defendant silent, and that high-level people were involved. The letter is a bombshell. The Democratic senators established a special committee to investigate. Sam Ervin, a conservative Southern senator with the appearance of a grandfather but the mind of a brilliant constitutional lawyer, will chair it. Nixon tries to contain the damage. He pressures his aides to maintain the false story. But the cracks widen. John Dean, the White House counsel who has coordinated much of the cover-up, begins to panic. He is 34 years old. He doesn't want to go to prison for the rest of his life protecting Nixon. He begins to consider cooperating with investigators. When Nixon finds out, he fires him. It's a fatal mistake. A frightened Dean is useful. A despised Dean is dangerous. March 21st, 1973. John Dean sits in the Oval Office and tells Nixon, "We have a cancer growing around the presidency." He describes the entire cover-up, the hush payments, the obstruction of justice, the lies. Dean estimates it will take $1 million to keep the conspirators quiet. Nixon casually discusses how to raise that money. The conversation is extraordinary in its frank criminality. What Nixon doesn't know is that this conversation, like all conversations in the Oval Office, is being recorded. In 1971, Nixon installed a secret recording system to preserve his conversations for history. He thought these tapes would demonstrate his strategic brilliance. Instead, they will preserve in exact detail his involvement in obstruction of justice. The tapes will become the evidence that will destroy him. But for now, they remain secret, known only to a handful of aides. May 1973. The Ervin Committee begins televised public hearings on Watergate. For 2 months, tens of millions of Americans watch as witness after witness describes a pattern of illegal activity, dirty tricks, and abuse of power. John Dean testifies for 5 days, directly implicating Nixon in the cover-up. It's his word against the president's. Nixon denies everything. It appears to be a stalemate. But then Alexander Butterfield, a low-profile aide, casually reveals that there's a recording system in the White House. The hearing room falls into stunned silence. Tapes? Recordings of every presidential conversation? That means there is objective evidence of what Nixon knew and when he knew it. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox immediately requests the tapes. Nixon refuses. He claims executive privilege. A legal battle begins that will go all the way to the Supreme Court. October 20th, 1973. Nixon orders Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Cox for pushing too hard for tapes. Richardson refuses and resigns. Nixon orders Assistant Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refuses and resigns. Eventually, Solicitor General Robert Bork agrees to fire Cox. 3 top Justice Department officials resigned or were fired in one night. The media calls it the Saturday Night Massacre. The public reaction is explosive. Phone calls to Congress demanding Nixon's impeachment crash the telephone systems. The appearance of guilt is overwhelming. Nixon seems like a desperate dictator trying to destroy the investigation that will expose him. He appoints a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, hoping he will be more docile. But Jaworski turns out to be equally tenacious. The walls are closing in, and Nixon, cornered, is about to become even more dangerous. November 1973. The White House is a fortress under siege. Nixon meets less and less with his cabinet. He spends days alone, writing notes, drinking, listening to loud classical music. The staff walks the halls in tense silence. Everyone knows they're working for a president who probably won't finish his term. But no one knows how it will end or when. Nixon appears in public less frequently. When he does, he looks haggard, and sometimes confused. There are rumors of emotional breakdowns. Kissinger, now Secretary of State, confidentially tells other officials that he sometimes finds the president kneeling in Lincoln's prayer room, weeping. Nixon, the man who never showed weakness, is crumbling under the relentless pressure. November 17, 1973. Nixon appears before 400 reporters at a televised press conference in Orlando, Florida. He is sweating, defensive, furious. When asked about Watergate and his personal finances, he explodes. The people have to know whether the president is a criminal or not. Well, I'm not a criminal. It is one of the clumsiest statements in presidential history. No one had ever directly accused him of being a criminal until he himself used the word. The phrase defines his moribund presidency. Skits on Saturday Night Live mimic him saying, "I'm not a criminal," over and over again. Newspapers use the quote in headlines. Nixon tried to project innocence and instead planted the idea of criminality in everyone's mind. It's a completely self-inflicted public relations disaster, the product of a man who has lost all political instinct. Special Prosecutor Jaworski continues to press for the tapes. Nixon hands over some, but with technical gaps. The most egregious is an 18.5-minute gap in a crucial conversation with Haldeman 3 days after the Watergate break-in. Nixon's secretary, Rose Mary Woods, claims she accidentally erased the conversation by reaching for the phone while transcribing. She demonstrates for the media an absurd physical contortion that becomes instantly ridiculous. No one believes the explanation. Audio experts testify that the breach was created through multiple deliberate manual deletions. What was in that conversation? We'll never know, but its very destruction is evidence of a guilty conscience. Nixon is destroying evidence, actively obstructing justice in the public eye, and every action intended to protect him deepens his apparent guilt. As Nixon fights for his political survival, the outside world continues to demand presidential attention. October 1973 brings the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. The United States supports Israel. Oil-producing Arab countries respond with an oil embargo. Oil prices quadruple. The United States faces its first serious energy crisis. Gasoline lines that last for hours, rationing, and a faltering economy. Nixon should be leading the national response. Instead, he's consumed by Watergate. Kissinger is handling the international crisis essentially alone. The economy is unraveling. High inflation combined with low growth, a combination called stagflation that will baffle economists for a decade. Nixon's second term, which should have been a period of consolidating his achievements, is turning into a disaster on all fronts. On October 10, 1973, just before the Saturday Night Massacre, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns. He has been accused of accepting bribes, tax evasion, and extortion during his time as Baltimore County Executive and Governor of Maryland. Agnew, who had been Nixon's most aggressive voice attacking critics, turns out to be thoroughly corrupt. He pleads guilty and resigns in disgrace. Nixon appoints Gerald Ford, the House Minority Leader, as the new vice president. Ford is respected, uncharismatic, but honest. Nixon's exact opposite in temperament. No one thinks much about the election at that point. But Ford, this nondescript congressman from Michigan, will soon become president of the United States in the most extraordinary way possible. For now, he merely provides a facade of normalcy while the administration disintegrates. April 1974. Special Prosecutor Jaworski takes the tape case to the Supreme Court. Nixon argues that executive privilege protects presidential conversations from subpoenas. Jaworski argues that no man, not even president, is above the law. The court agrees to hear the case on an expedited schedule. Everyone understands that the decision will determine whether Nixon survives or falls. Nixon's lawyers know they are on weak ground, for the Supreme Court justices were appointed by Nixon himself. If even the justices he appointed vote against him, the legitimacy of the decision will be unquestionable. Nixon considers challenging any ruling against him, simply refusing to hand over the tapes. His closest advisors warn him that this would provoke a constitutional crisis that could end with the military having to choose between the president and the Supreme Court. May 1974. The House Judiciary Committee begins formal impeachment hearings. Peter Rodino, a Democrat from New Jersey, presides with deliberate dignity. The committee includes a young congressman from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, serving as legal counsel. Also present is Barbara Jordan, a representative from Texas, whose speech on the Constitution will become legendary. The hearings are methodical, almost painfully slow. Every piece of evidence is reviewed. Every legal precedent is considered. It's not a thrilling television drama like the Irvin hearings. It's a sober constitutional process, doing exactly what the Founding Fathers intended, determining whether a president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors. Even some Republicans are beginning to acknowledge that the evidence is overwhelming. July 24, 1974. The Supreme Court issues its decision in United States versus Nixon. The vote is unanimous. 8-0, one justice recused himself. Nixon must turn over the tapes. Executive privilege is not absolute. When there is evidence of criminality, the judiciary can compel evidence even from the president. It is one of the most important constitutional rulings in American history, and it is a total defeat for Nixon. That same night, Nixon meets with his family. He tells them the tapes contain troubling conversations. His daughter, Julie, who has passionately defended her father in public, begins to understand that the accusations could be true, but she continues to urge him to fight. His wife, Pat, who has endured decades of political humiliation, remains silent. She knows it's over. It's only a matter of time. From July 25th to 30th, the House Judiciary Committee approves 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. Article 1, obstruction of justice. Article 2, abuse of power. Article 3, contempt of Congress. The vote is not strictly partisan. Several Republicans vote in favor of impeachment. The evidence is simply too strong to ignore. Nixon knows the articles will easily pass the full House. Then the case would move to the Senate for trial. Could he survive a Senate trial? His aides conduct a tally. Perhaps 10 senators would definitely vote against his impeachment. Another 15 are undecided. He needs 34 votes to survive. The numbers are possible but uncertain. And then the tapes turned over to investigators begin to be transcribed. August 5th, 1974. The White House releases transcripts of 3 conversations recorded on June 23rd, 1972, 6 days after the Watergate break-in. In these tapes, Nixon and Haldeman explicitly discuss using the CIA to block the FBI's investigation into Watergate. Its obstruction of justice, clear and undeniable in Nixon's own voice. It's the smoking gun investigators have been looking for. Nixon's last Republican defenders in Congress abandoned ship. Senate Republican leaders inform him that he has no more than 15 guaranteed votes in an impeachment trial. He will be found guilty and removed from office. His only defense lawyer resigns. Nixon is completely alone. There is no legal move he can make. No political maneuver can save him. The question is no longer whether he will fall, but how and when he will choose to make his final exit. August 6, 1974. The Oval Office once the center of American power, now feels like a tomb. Nixon sits at his desk, surrounded by boxes of files that the staff discreetly begins to pack. The phone calls of support have ceased. The advisors who once filled the anterooms awaiting audiences now find reasons to be elsewhere. Power, Nixon discovers, is the most fleeting of all states. One day you have it absolutely. The next, you'll become a ghost in your own palace. Henry Kissinger comes to visit him. He finds Nixon an emotional wreck, talking erratically about history, about his achievements in China, about the unjustness of it all. At one point, Nixon asks Kissinger to kneel with him and pray together. Kissinger, the agnostic Jew, the supreme realist, kneels uncomfortably as the U.S. president sobs and prays. It is a scene of Shakespearean pathos. The most powerful man in the world reduced to pleading for divine comfort from a God he barely believes in. August 7th. Nixon summons his cabinet for what everyone knows will likely be its last meeting. He sits at the head of the long table. The secretaries avoid direct eye contact. Nixon begins to talk about policy, about initiatives that will never be completed, about plans for a future he will never experience. It's surreal. Everyone in the room knows they are witnessing an end, but Nixon seems unable to get the words out. Finally, his voice cracks. He speaks of his father, the failed businessman who never lived long enough to see his son become president. He speaks of his mother, the Quaker saint who taught peace but raised a son who waged war. His eyes moisten. The cabinet members squirm in discomfort. This man, who always so carefully controlled his public image, is crumbling before them. It is painful to witness. That night, Nixon meets with his family. Pat, his wife of 34 years, his daughters Julie and Tricia, his sons-in-law David Eisenhower and Edward Cox. Julie still urges him to fight, to force an impeachment trial in the Senate, to have him dragged, kicking and screaming. Tricia remains silent, tears streaming down her face. Pat, the one who has suffered the most from her husband's ambitions, simply says, "Do what you must do." Nixon makes his decision. He will resign. He will not be impeached. He will retain that small shred of dignity. He will be able to say he left on his own terms, for the good of the country. It's a comforting lie he will tell himself for the rest of his life. The truth is that he is fleeing a trial that would have convicted him and potentially sent him to prison. But even in defeat, Nixon needs the illusion of control. August 8, 1974. 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Nixon sits before the cameras for the last time as president. He wrote the speech himself, rejecting his writer's drafts. He wears a dark suit and blue tie. His face is puffy, aged a decade and 2 years. He begins to speak in a controlled but tense voice. In all my years of public service, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation, he says. He admits no crimes. He accepts no guilt. He acknowledges only incorrect judgments, as if Watergate were merely a miscalculation rather than a criminal conspiracy. He explains that without sufficient political support in Congress, he must resign effective tomorrow at noon. He is clinical, almost cold. Even at this moment, Nixon cannot allow himself to be fully human. August 9th. At 9:30 a.m. Nixon gathers the White House staff in the East Room to say goodbye. There are hundreds of people, secretaries, aides, security personnel, many of them crying. Nixon steps onto a makeshift podium. What happens next is the strangest and most revealing speech he will ever give. He rambles on about his father, a little man, a lemon gardener. He speaks of his mother as a saint. He becomes almost delirious, quoting Theodore Roosevelt about how a man in the arena is judged. He tells the young staffers never to be bitter, never to hate their enemies. Those who hate us never win unless we hate back, and then we destroy ourselves. It is advice he himself could never follow. His entire life was defined by hatred of perceived enemies. Nixon ends his rambling speech by raising his arms in his signature double V for victory gesture. It's absurd. He's resigning in disgrace, and yet he makes the gesture of triumph. But somehow it's also poignant. This broken man, this political genius wrecked by his own demons, still can't fully admit defeat. Pat Nixon steps onto the stage and takes his arm. Together, they walk toward the Marine One helicopter, waiting on the South Lawn. The Nixon family climbs onto the helicopter ramp. At the door, Nixon turns around one last time. He raises his arms again in the V for victory. The blade begins to spin. The helicopter rises from the White House lawn. From the window, Nixon can see the Washington Monument, the Capitol, the city that was the center of his universe for a quarter of a century. Then the helicopter turns and flies south, carrying the former president into exile. 12 noon. In the East Room, Gerald Ford raises his right hand and is sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. He is the only president in history never elected either president or vice president. Our long national nightmare is over, he declares. It's a line that will resonate. America, exhausted by 2 years of scandal, desperately wants to believe it's true. But the nightmare isn't really over. The wounds of Watergate run deep. Trust in government has been shattered. Cynicism about politicians has become the default attitude. The media, emboldened by its role in bringing down a president, will become ever more aggressive and investigative. The era of American innocence, if it ever existed, is definitely over. Nixon didn't just destroy himself. He damaged the very institution of the presidency in ways that will take generations to heal. Nixon's helicopter lands at Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One is waiting. Except it's not Air Force One anymore, because Nixon is no longer president. It's just a government plane taking a private citizen to California. Nixon and Pat take the long, silent flight across the continent. They land in San Clemente, where Nixon owns an oceanfront estate called La Casa Pacifica. For days, Nixon remains locked in his study. Not even Pat can reach him. He has lost everything: the power, the prestige, the purpose that defined his adult life. He is 61 years old. If he lives an average lifespan, he has 20 years or more left. What does an impeached former president do with the rest of his life? How do you live when you've reached the absolute pinnacle of world power and then fallen lower than anyone in your position before? September 8th, 1974. President Ford announces that he is granting a full and unconditional presidential pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he has committed or may have committed while in office. The reaction is explosive. Ford's approval ratings plummet. Many believe there was a deal. Nixon resigns. Ford pardons him. Ford denied this until his death, insisting that he pardoned Nixon to allow the country to move on. The pardon means Nixon will never face a criminal trial, while his subordinates, 24 men in all, go to prison for Watergate. The man who orchestrated the cover-up remains free. It's deeply unjust, but also arguably necessary. A trial of a former president would have consumed the country for years. The pardon is pragmatic, but it leaves a bitter taste. Nixon accepts the pardon, which legally is an admission of guilt, but publicly, he still doesn't admit to having done anything wrong. October 1974. Nixon is rushed to the hospital with acute phlebitis. Blood clots in his legs that could travel to his lungs and kill him. Doctors say his condition is critical. For days, he teeters on the brink of death. Pat remains at his bedside. His daughters fly in from the East Coast. It appears Richard Nixon could die just 2 months after resigning, his legacy permanently defined by disgrace. But Nixon doesn't die. His body, hardened by decades of political struggle, stubbornly clings to life. He slowly recovers. And as he lies in that hospital bed, something hardens inside him. He won't accept that Watergate will be the final word on his life. He will spend the next 2 decades trying to rebuild his reputation, rewrite his legacy, convince the world that he was a great leader destroyed by vengeful enemies. It will be his last and longest campaign. And surprisingly, in some respects, he will be partially successful. 1975. The Pacifica House in San Clemente has become a fortress of solitude. Nixon has laid off almost his entire staff. He can't pay their salaries. The government has stripped him of his presidential privileges. His pension is modest. He faces massive legal bills. The man who once controlled the federal budget now worries about how to pay the monthly bills. It's a fall from Olympus. Nixon spends his days walking alone on the beach, writing bitter notes on his yellow legal pads. At night, he drinks too much. Pat occasionally finds him crying alone in his study. His depression is deep, almost clinical. His former aides rarely visit. Washington had forgotten him with astonishing speed. In the Capitol, it's as if the Nixon years never happened. New generations of politicians don't even mention his name except as a warning. 1977. Nixon, desperate for money in a public forum, agrees to participate in a series of paid televised interviews with David Frost, a British interviewer. Nixon will negotiate $600,000 plus a percentage of the profits. It's an extraordinary sum for his time. But Nixon needs the money. And more than that, he needs the opportunity to explain himself, to control the narrative. The interviews are recorded over 12 sessions in March and April. Frost has done his homework meticulously. Nixon arrives prepared with elaborate arguments to justify each action. Most of the sessions are dead heat. But then Frost confronts Nixon directly about the Watergate cover-up. Were you ever involved in a cover-up? Frost asks. Nixon tries to evade, rationalize, redefine terms. Frost doesn't budge. In the most famous moment of the interviews, Nixon attempts to explain his philosophy of executive power. He argues that the president has inherent authority to do things that would be illegal for other citizens if done in the interest of national security. Frost presses him. So the president is above the law? Nixon responds with a line that will haunt him forever. Well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. It's an astonishing statement of unlimited executive authority, the constitutional theory of a would-be monarch. Law professors will use it for decades as an example of everything wrong with the imperial presidency. But Nixon genuinely believes this. In his mind, his actions were always justified by extraordinary circumstances. The problem wasn't what he did, but that he was caught. It's the morality of a man who never truly internalized the limitations of democratic power. Toward the end of the interviews, Frost achieves something remarkable. Nixon, with tears in his eyes, offers something close to an apology. I let the American people down, and I'll have to carry that burden for the rest of my life. It's not an admission of wrongdoing, but it is an acknowledgement of moral responsibility, something Nixon has rarely offered. The interviews were broadcast in May 1977. 45 million Americans watched them, a huge number. Reactions were mixed. Some felt Nixon finally showed genuine humanity. Others thought it was a manipulative performance by a master deceiver. It was probably both. Nixon is too complex for simple assessments. But the interviews mark a turning point. Nixon returns to public discourse, albeit as a tragic figure rather than a leader. Over the next 2 decades, Nixon reinvented himself as an author and elder statesman of foreign policy. He wrote 10 books. His 1978 memoirs, simply titled are over 1,000 pages of detailed self-justification and historical revision. His subsequent books on foreign policy, particularly on relations with China and Russia, are respected for their analytical acumen. Nixon travels extensively, albeit discreetly. He meets with world leaders who remember him from his days in power. In Beijing, he is treated as a historic friend of China. Soviet leaders consult with him unofficially. Slowly, meticulously, he builds a reputation as a foreign policy sage, someone whose views on international affairs command respect despite Watergate. It's a partial resurrection, but a real one. The 1980s bring a generational shift. Ronald Reagan, who once defended Nixon during Watergate, is president. Republicans control the Senate. Conservatism is on the rise. The Republican Party, which once wanted to forget Nixon, begins to remember him selectively, focusing on his openness to China and his electoral victories while downplaying the scandal. Reagan invites Nixon to the White House in 1986. It is the first time Nixon has returned since his resignation. The visit is private, with no press coverage, but it symbolizes a gradual rehabilitation. Nixon advises Reagan on Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. His advice is considered valuable. He is no longer a complete pariah. He is a resource, albeit one used discreetly, out of public view. 1989 to 1991. The Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union disintegrates. The Cold War, the conflict that defined Nixon's adult life, end with American victory. Nixon can legitimately claim that his policy of détente, his opening to China, his triangular diplomacy, contributed to this outcome. It is a belated validation of his strategic vision. Nixon writes extensively about the end of the Cold War, offering advice on how the West should handle Russia's transition. His analyses are published in major newspapers. He is a guest on talk shows, no longer as a disgraced president, but as a former statesman with unique perspectives. The transformation is remarkable, from political criminal to respected commentator on world affairs. It's not a complete pardon, but it's something. June 1993. Pat Nixon suffers a massive stroke and dies at the age of 81. She had been a smoker all her adult life. Her final years were marked by repeated illnesses. Nixon is devastated. Whatever the complexity of their marriage, Pat was his one constant for 53 years. She supported him through victories and defeats, through triumphs and humiliations. At his funeral, Nixon weeps openly. It's one of the few times the public sees him with genuine, unfiltered emotion. Pat never wanted political life. She hated it, in fact. But she followed her husband through it, because that's what wives of her generation did. She paid a terrible price for Nixon's ambitions. And to the very end, she maintained her quiet dignity. She is the greatest victim of the Nixon saga, the person who did nothing wrong but suffered endlessly. April 1994. Nixon suffers a severe stroke at his home in New Jersey. He is hospitalized, unconscious. His daughters keep vigil. Doctors say the brain damage is massive. There is no hope of significant recovery. Nixon remains in a coma for 4 days. On April 22nd, he dies at age 81. There is a cruel irony. The man who spent his life obsessed with control dies completely powerless, unconscious, with no final words. April 27, 1994. Leaders from around the world gather at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, for his funeral. 5 presidents are present: Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. Senator Bob Dole delivers a moving eulogy, tears streaming down his face. The second after he fell, he started on his way back. Dole says of Nixon, Clinton, the young Democratic president who once worked on Nixon's impeachment trial, offers generous remarks about his foreign policy achievements. It's remarkable. The political establishment that Nixon so despised now honors him in death. But the carefully chosen words reveal the ongoing tension. They can praise his strategic brilliance while studiously avoiding mentioning the crimes that brought him down. Nixon is buried next to Pat on the grounds of his presidential library. Even in death, his legacy remains irresolvably divided. 20 years after his death, 30 years after his resignation, 50 years after his presidency, Richard Nixon remains impossible to forget. His black and white face still appears in documentaries. His name remains synonymous with political scandal. Every presidential crisis invites comparisons with Watergate. Every political cover-up earns the suffix "gate." Nixon wished to be remembered as a great statesman. Instead, he became the eternal measure of presidential corruption. But there's something deeper in his enduring legacy. Nixon represents something fundamental about American politics, about human ambition, about the price of power. His story is a Greek tragedy played out on the stage of modern democracy, the brilliant man destroyed by his fatal flaw. We can't look away because we see in Nixon the seeds of corruption that exist in every political system, in every leader, perhaps in all of us. If there's one thing Nixon will be remembered for beyond the scandal, it's his opening to China. In February 1972, when he shook hands with Mao Zedong, Nixon fundamentally shifted the global balance of power. That Sino-American relationship, initiated by Nixon, shaped the next 4 decades of global politics. Trade between the United States and China grew from virtually nothing to hundreds of billions annually. It wasn't just trade. It was higher-level strategic thinking. Understanding that the world is not bipolar but multipolar, that temporary enemies can be useful against more dangerous adversaries, that diplomacy requires flexibility, not rigid ideology. Subsequent presidents, from both parties, build on the foundations Nixon laid. Even as Sino-U.S. relations strained in subsequent decades, Nixon's strategic framework remained relevant. But Watergate remains his defining legacy. And perhaps it should. Because Watergate wasn't just about a clumsy burglary and a cover-up. It was about the limits of executive power in a democracy. It was about whether a president is above the law. It was about what happens when elected leaders confuse the national interest with their personal interest. These aren't ancient questions. They're eternal. American institutions were tested by Watergate, and, remarkably, they held up. The system of checks and balances worked. The free press investigated. Congress acted. The courts failed. A corrupt president was forced to resign. No one died. There was no military coup. Power was transferred peacefully. It was American constitutionalism at its best, emerging from a trial by fire to prove that the republic could be saved even from its highest leaders. But Watergate also left scars. Trust in government, already damaged by Vietnam, completely collapsed. A generation of Americans learned to assume that politicians lie, that power corrupts, that idealism is naivete. Cynicism became the default intellectual stance. Everyone does it became the comforting axiom justifying political apathy. This cynicism was entirely unjustified. Watergate revealed that the U.S. government had been conducting illegal operations for years: domestic surveillance, infiltration of activist groups, assassinations of foreign leaders. The imperial presidency didn't begin with Nixon, but he took it to its logical conclusion. And when the edifice collapsed, it revealed cracks in the foundation that no one had been willing to examine too closely. Watergate set the template for all subsequent political scandals. The pattern repeats itself. The initial transgression, the cover-up worse than the crime, the gradually intensifying investigation, the congressional hearings, the pressure for the leader to resign. From Iran-Contra to Lewinsky to the most recent impeachment investigations, the Watergate script plays out with different actors and details. Nixon also established a defense model: deny, attack investigators, claim political conspiracy, stretch executive privilege to the breaking point. His tactics ultimately didn't work for him, but he showed future impeached leaders exactly what arguments to make, what lines of defense to attempt. The difference is that successors learned the crucial lesson that Nixon couldn't: destroy the tapes. Leave no definitive evidence of your guilt. The most fascinating aspect of Nixon's legacy is the central contradiction. He was brilliant, genuinely, extraordinarily brilliant. His analytical ability, his memory, his strategic thinking, his grasp of geopolitics, all were first-rate. Had he channeled that brilliance exclusively into public service, he could have been one of the greatest presidents. Instead, he twisted it into paranoia, resentment, and ultimately self-destruction. This is Nixon's most disturbing lesson. Intelligence isn't enough. Character matters. Integrity matters. A genius without a moral compass is more dangerous than a fool with good intentions. Nixon possessed all the tools for greatness except the one that mattered most: the ability to trust, to let go of grudges, to distinguish between legitimate enemies and honest disagreements. His genius became the instrument of his own downfall. But perhaps the most tragic thing about Nixon is that even his greatest achievements never brought in the acceptance he desperately sought. The Eastern elites who despised him as a young lawyer still despise him as president. The Kennedy and Rockefeller families never accepted him as their equal. The intellectuals he admired never admired him back. All the power in the world couldn't buy the one thing Nixon truly wanted: to feel fully accepted and respected by those he perceived as his betters. This fundamental insecurity is what makes Nixon eternally relatable. We all know the feeling of being the outsider. We've all felt that others have unfair advantages. We've all struggled with the feeling of not being good enough. Nixon took those universal feelings and amplified them on a presidential scale. His tragedy is the tragedy of allowing insecurity to control your actions, of never being able to enjoy success because you're too busy fearing loss. 50 years after Watergate, certain questions remain unanswered. What was contained in the 18-and-a-half-minute gap in the tapes? How much did Nixon really know before the break-in? Did he personally order the illegal operations, or simply create an environment where subordinates understood such actions would be rewarded? Could he have survived if he had admitted everything immediately and fired those responsible? But perhaps the bigger question is counterfactual. What kind of president would Nixon have been without paranoia? If he had been able to enjoy his 1972 victory without immediately sabotaging it with covert operations? If he had been able to rely on his considerable skills without constantly resorting to tricks and deception, it could have been transformative. Instead, it was tragic. Nixon remains relevant because he holds up a dark mirror to America itself. His boundless ambition reflects the American spirit. His resentment of inherited privilege reflects American egalitarian impulses. His willingness to bend rules in the name of higher goals reflects American pragmatism. His eventual downfall reflects the American commitment to the rule of law. In Nixon, we see both the virtues and vices of American political culture distilled into a single, complex, and flawed man. Different generations reinterpret Nixon for their own times. For those who lived through the 1960s, he's the villain who prolonged Vietnam. For foreign policy scholars, he's the brilliant realist who opened up China. For constitutionalists, he's proof that the system works. For cynics, he's proof that power always corrupts. They're all right. Nixon was great and complex enough to be all of these things simultaneously. And so we end where we began, in paradoxes. Richard Nixon was a president who won 49 states in 1972 and resigned in disgrace in 1974. The communist hunter who opened up China. The defender of law and order who obstructed justice. The strategic genius who destroyed himself. The man who achieved everything and lost everything. The leader who changed the world but could not change himself. In his memoirs, Nixon wrote, "I've always had to work harder than others to do the same things they found easy." It was his lifelong mantra, his explanation for everything. He worked harder. He gave it his all. And yet, somehow it all went wrong. Not because the universe was unfair, though he believed it was, but because the demons that drove him up eventually dragged him down. Richard Nixon died 30 years ago, but his shadow is still with us. Every time a leader abuses power, every time a politician chooses cover-up over truth-telling, every time we debate the limits of executive power, Nixon is there warning us, not about the dangers of ambition, but about the danger of ambition without spine, not about the risks of power, but about the risks of allowing paranoia to control power. His story isn't a story about politics. It's a story about human nature, about how our greatest strengths, taken to the extreme, become our greatest weaknesses, about how the need for love and acceptance, when unmet, can twist into resentment and destruction, about how a poor kid from California can rise to the absolute pinnacle of world power and still, on some deep level, remain that kid, hungry, scared, insecure, never loved enough. Richard Nixon wanted to be remembered as great. Instead, he will be remembered as tragic. But perhaps that is its own form of greatness. Because tragedy, true tragedy, is not about evil people doing evil things. It's about complex human people making imperfect human choices that lead to consequences they never intended. It's about how all of us, with the right weaknesses amplified by the right circumstances, could fall exactly as he did. That's the final lesson of Richard Nixon. It's not that he was just corrupt. It's that he wasn't. He was human. Deeply, painfully, complicatedly human. And that's the most disturbing truth of all.